You've probably petted a dog today, or wanted to. Now imagine trying to do the same thing to a wild fox, even one raised from birth by a human. It would almost certainly bite you, bolt, or both. Dogs and foxes aren't even that far apart genetically. Same family, similar size, similar diet, similar intelligence by most measures. So why does one curl up on your couch and the other still can't be trusted around your ankles? Here's the part most people get wrong. It was never really about the species. It was about one specific trait, and almost nobody knew it existed until a Soviet scientist accidentally proved it decades ago. In 1959, a geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev started an experiment in Siberia that would quietly answer this question. He wasn't trying to make friendly foxes. He was trying to understand domestication itself, and foxes happened to be the perfect test subject because nobody had ever domesticated one before, and none of the emotional history tied to dogs and wolves would cloud the results. His method was almost absurdly simple. Every generation, he selected only the calmest foxes, the ones that showed the least fear and the least aggression toward humans, and bred just those individuals together. Nothing else. No training, no taming, no handling beyond a brief approach test. Just selecting for one trait, tolerance of humans. Within just a few generations, something strange started happening. The foxes weren't just calmer, they were changing physically. Floppy ears started appearing, curled tails, patches of white fur, shorter snouts. Traits nobody had selected for at all, yet they kept showing up anyway, generation after generation, as a side effect of selecting for tameness alone. This became known as domestication syndrome, and it's one of the strangest discoveries in modern genetics. Selecting for calm behavior seems to drag along a whole package of physical changes with it, because the genes controlling stress hormones and the genes controlling physical development are tangled together far more than anyone expected. Change one system and the other quietly shifts along with it. By generation 10, some of Belyaev's foxes were wagging their tails at researchers. By generation 30, some were seeking out human affection the way puppies do, whining for attention, following researchers around their enclosures. Genetically, they were still foxes. Behaviorally, they had become something closer to dogs in under a lifetime of breeding. So if it only took a few decades to prove this was possible, why didn't it happen naturally thousands of years ago the way it did with wolves? The honest answer comes down to a difference in social structure that most people never think about. Wolves live and hunt in cooperative packs with a clear hierarchy. They're built to defer to a leader, to work alongside others, to read social cues and respond to them. That wiring made early wolves unusually receptive to slotting a human into the role of pack leader, something a solitary animal simply has no framework for. Foxes are almost the opposite. They're largely solitary animals. They don't form the same kind of cooperative social structure, don't naturally defer to a hierarchy, and don't have the same built-in wiring for reading and responding to another creature's social signals. The raw material domestication depends on a willingness to bond into a hierarchy was never really there to begin with, no matter how much time you gave it. This is also why proximity alone was never enough. Humans and foxes have lived near each other for as long as humans and wolves have. Foxes have scavenged around human settlements for thousands of years, sometimes even living closer to us than wolves did, slipping through villages at night for scraps. Access wasn't the missing ingredient. Temperament was, and no amount of shared territory could substitute for it. There's also a timing problem that made things worse. Wolves that eventually became dogs were most easily tamed as young pups during a narrow developmental window where they're naturally more open to bonding with unfamiliar animals, including humans. Fox pups have a dramatically shorter version of that same window. By a few weeks old, a wild fox pup is already wired to treat unfamiliar creatures with caution rather than curiosity. Miss that narrow window, and the opportunity is gone for good, no matter how gently the animal is handled afterward. Early humans, without any understanding of genetics or developmental windows, would have simply experienced this as foxes being unpredictable and untrainable compared to wolf pups, which stayed receptive to bonding for a much longer stretch of their early life. Over enough attempts across enough generations, humans quietly gravitated toward the animal that actually cooperated, and the relationship compounded from there. Diet may have played a role too, though it's a smaller piece of the puzzle. Wolves scavenging around early human camps had every incentive to tolerate human presence, since proximity meant access to food scraps. That created constant natural selection pressure favoring the boldest, calmest wolves, the ones willing to approach a fire, a camp, or a group of people without bolting. Foxes, being smaller and more solitary hunters, didn't cluster around human settlements the same way in large social groups, so that same selection pressure never had the same population to work on in the first place. Then there's a factor that's easy to underestimate: usefulness. Early humans didn't just domesticate animals that happened to be calm, they domesticated animals that solved a problem. Wolves turned dogs helped with hunting, guarding, and herding, tasks that directly improved a human group's odds of survival. That usefulness gave humans a reason to keep investing in the relationship generation after generation, reinforcing the selection process even further. Foxes never filled an equivalent role. They were competitors for small prey, sometimes even pests around livestock, which meant humans had far less incentive to nurture a bond with them at all, and every reason to keep them at a distance instead. Belyaev's experiment also revealed something that complicates the idea that tameness alone was the entire answer. His team ran a second, quieter version of the same study, breeding foxes for aggression instead of calmness. Those foxes became measurably more aggressive within a similar number of generations, snapping at handlers and resisting approach entirely, proving the trait could be pushed in either direction almost equally fast. Temperament wasn't fixed. It was simply never pushed toward tameness in the wild the way it was pushed toward tameness in a controlled Siberian breeding program. This matters because it rules out a tempting but wrong explanation that foxes are simply born wild in a way dogs aren't. They're not. The same species carries the biological capacity to become either dramatically friendlier or dramatically more hostile, depending entirely on which foxes get to breed. Wild populations simply never experienced the kind of single-minded selection pressure that would push them in the tame direction on their own. And the fox experiment isn't actually the only case proving this pattern. Decades later, researchers studying farmed mink noticed something remarkably similar happening almost by accident. Mink bred for generations purely for calmer handling on fur farms, with no intention of studying domestication at all, began showing the same unexpected physical shifts seen in Belyaev's foxes: coat pattern changes, altered stress hormone levels, behavioral differences that showed up as a side effect of selecting for one trait alone. Nobody set out to prove Belyaev's findings again. It happened as an accidental byproduct of ordinary farm breeding decisions, which makes the pattern even harder to dismiss as a fluke unique to one lab in Siberia. Rats tell a similar story. Laboratory rats, selectively bred over generations purely for ease of handling, have grown visibly tamer and more tolerant of humans compared to their wild ancestors, again accompanied by subtle physical changes that were never deliberately selected for. Wild rats, meanwhile, remained just as skittish and defensive around humans as they were centuries ago, despite living in constant close proximity to us in cities and worldwide. Proximity, once again, did nothing on its own. Only deliberate, sustained selection pressure toward calmness ever produced the shift. Taken together, these separate, independent cases point to the same underlying rule. Tameness isn't something that emerges just from animals spending time near humans. It has to be actively selected for, generation after generation, whether that selection happens deliberately in a lab, accidentally on a fur farm, or slowly across thousands of years of early human settlements favoring the calmest wolves without anyone consciously deciding to do so. So could foxes still become dogs someday, given enough time? In theory, yes. Belyaev's fox line, along with the mink and rat evidence that followed it, proved the biological pathway exists and can move remarkably fast under the right pressure. But recreating that in the wild would require exactly what a lab could provide, and nature couldn't. Strict, deliberate, generation after generation selection for one single trait, with every other variable controlled. Nature doesn't work that way. Wild fox populations face constant pressure from predators, disease, competition, and food scarcity, all pulling selection in dozens of directions at once. Tameness toward humans was never going to be the dominant survival pressure shaping their evolution, the way it accidentally became for wolves living at the edges of early human camps, where calm behavior directly translated into easier access to food and safety. Which leaves us with a strange kind of answer. Dogs didn't become domesticated because they were special among wild canines. They became domesticated because they happened to already have the social wiring domestication needed. They had a developmental window generous enough for humans to work with, and they offered something useful enough that humans kept the relationship going. Foxes had almost none of those things lined up in their favor, not because they were less intelligent or less capable, but because their entire social and developmental biology was quietly built for something else entirely. Somewhere in Siberia, a small, carefully bred population of foxes is proof that biology was never really the barrier. Opportunity was. And 10,000 years ago, opportunity happened to land on wolves, one campfire at a time, while foxes were left circling the edges of the very same fires, always close and yet never quite invited in.